and we are blessed to have him with us today. So please welcome Mr. Adel Guindy. And he is going to sit and give his remarks.
Good morning. Sorry, I have a bit of blood circulation problem, so I prefer to speak while sitting down. I had in mind actually to cover the topic in 3 or 3.5 subtopics, if you like. One is the historical footprint of the Copts. 2, the heritage of the Copts. 3, which we seldom talk about, is the dilemma of the modern nation state as applied to Egypt. And a 4th topic, just to link up all these things. Given the time constraints and just not to get bogged on the first 2, we speak a lot about them. The first 2, we speak a lot, so I'll dive straight into number 3, and then retract and go back to speak about number 1. The modern nation state is a concept that started in Europe, as you know, in the 17th century, and then took its form with the revolutions of the States and the France, and then little by little in Europe, and then started to become more or less over the world. But how did it go in Egypt? I think that's a key thing, and we don't speak about it at all, and that's a dilemma of the Copts today, that we are trying to imagine that they live in a nation state where they get their equal rights as citizens, while in fact they do not. What went wrong? But to get that, we need to get back into what happened. How was the status of the Copts in the Middle Ages? We speak a lot about the horrible persecution since the 7th century and all the way up till today. But we often do not mention that there was some time, across the centuries, there was a duality. The Copts were never politically autonomous, but they had some autonomy in social and educational things. Why is that? That's the nature of the thing at the time. There was no country, there was no countries everywhere. There were basically communities, groups, and the rulers run the system, if you like, in a way that suits them, but the subgroups actually manage. There's a question of communication, there's a question of balances of interests and forces and so on. So the Copts had some independence in a number of things. One of them is education. The education of the Copts educated their kids in, decentralized system. There was no curricula, if you like, but, most churches, local churches, had a school where kids were taught Coptic language, Arabic language later on when it became more dominant, religion, and arithmetic. That's one of the reasons why actually all along the Arab eras, the Copts were doing the accounting work for the government, for the warlords, for the Mamluks, for the governors, and so on. And that gives them some sort of, a protection because they were needed. They were needed because they were proficient. And they were proficient because they were given some relatively, at the age, good education. Another area was the sort of the civil status. You know, they were married according to church laws. The state has nothing to do with anything. They get married and they get divorced and so on. Not only that, actually, there was some sort of a system whereby the justice was handled by the sub-communities of the country. If there are two Copts, you know, getting in a disagreement or a dispute or something, there could be not a judge, but you know, either the priest or the archon. The archon is the elite archon from the Greek, which means the head. They are the sort of either the richer or the more educated or the one who has some government connections and so on. And these archons act as, you know, pseudo judges. And as long as the two sides accept the sort of the position of the person, everything goes fine. So, you know, if there's a dispute between two Copts, it can be handled unless one of the two asks to go in front of the Sharia judge. In that case, they have to go to the church. If the dispute is between a Copt and a Muslim, there's no discussion. It has to go in front of the Sharia judge. Okay? So, relatively speaking, and marriage issues too. So, if for instance, a divorce or a wife complains, and there are documents about that published, that where, you know, if the two sides accept the ruling of the church or a church entity, it's okay. It can be arranged. But if, you know, some side, one side, the wife usually thinks that she's not getting a fair deal, she can ask to be seen, the case be seen in front of the Sharia judge. In that case, it has to be, and the rule applies. So these are the, you know, the things that were more or less dominant. Come back to the story of the nation state, starting with, you know, basically since the French expedition in the end of 18th century, the beginning of 19th century, Muhammad Ali, the state started gradually to become, you know, more in line, bit by bit, with what's happening in Europe. Egypt had sort of not a House of Representatives, but a select a chamber to write laws and so on under Khedive Ismail as of the 1860s. And, you know, and by the end of the 19th century, the British installed in Egypt some protectorate. And beginning of the 20th centuries, you know, the ideas of modern state were brewing all over the world, and so also Egypt. So at the time of, you know, the joint efforts between Copts and Muslims to get rid of the British occupation, I think if you think about it, the Copts were getting aware of the evolution in the world in terms of the country foundation, and they could see that a nation state is in the process of developing in Egypt, and they would see themselves fitting as citizens, but they did not realize that actually by doing that they will have some consequences later on, which we are suffering on, they are suffering on until today, in terms of losing what they had by way of partial autonomy in certain things, and not gaining in terms of citizenship. That's the dilemma of the Copts today. So, for instance, the education in the 19th century, 1860 and so on, under the patriarch, the so-called the father of reform, the first schools, general schools, proper schools, and with expanded curriculum were established by the Copts, and they were open to non-Copts, to Muslims. And in fact, they were so high quality that many of the people who led the country in Egypt, beginning of the 20th century, were educated in the Coptic schools. The government, late 19th century, started making formal governmental schools too, little by little, and that was expanding. But there was a duality. There was still the church schools and there was the government schools. Little by little, the expansion, the public education came. But then you notice what was happening. The curricula were dual. Everybody, if each system had its own curricula. But then, beginning of the 20th century, the government started to impose minimum curricula on both. And for instance, the public schools would teach religion, only Islam. You know, already the nation state became linked more to Islam than what basically the same way as it was before. It was a state and a government, but with the coloring of the Islam. One important thing is the constitution. The first constitution that Egypt has is 1923, exactly 100 years, actually almost to the month. It was promulgated in April, and was, sort of modern, as per the standards of the time. Constitution had really close to the end an article number 149, simply stating that Arabic was the language of the country and Islam the regional state. Nobody knows, and there are so many stories about how the constituent committee accepted that. Did it come from a group, the Muslims? There was a Christian representation in the constituent committee. It was 30. There were 6 Christians and 1 Jew, actually. 7 out of the 30. How did it pass to accept that? Were it considered to be serious, or maybe say this is a kind of nod to the majority of the population, not to raise any problem? It's good to have a constitution anyway, but it's okay, and it's way to the end that this kind of thing it applies. But this had consequences. It was never forgotten. It was never ignored, to the point that actually one Muslim jurist, Mahmoud Azmi, objected to it, and the same person wanted to instill in that constitution a minimum of representation in any future coming parliament to ensure that the Copts are well represented or represented. So the committee voted out that proposition, and he had a good foresight and said, this is a problem because now we're creating a new state, we're making an institution, and the equality, it cannot be ensured in a country, a Muslim country, which had a long history where the non-Muslims are simply dhimmis. And this carried on and on, and you can see the consequences of that. I mean, there's lots of stories about how would, for instance, the education, the schools, the training, education of the language, and so on, until we reached the constitution of the modern Egypt, 1980, where Sadat imposed the famous Article 2, and instead of one Article 149 became a second article, and Sharia, instead of being It wasn't actually in the 1923 Constitution. It became a source of legislation, and then later on he modified it to make it the principal source of legislation. So the Constitution, I was discussing with Raymond earlier today, the Constitution of Egypt, if you look at many articles about equality, about freedom of thought, freedom of religion, fantastic, and all kinds of fantastic stuff. But there is an understanding that the overriding article is the Article 2, which speaks about the Islam being the religion of state. So whereas I go back to the comparison between the modern nation state in Egypt and in other places, the Constitution of the United States states that there is no church shall be established. The same in France, the same in many places, and even in the countries in some Northern Europe where they have a church established, it's usually a matter of collecting the taxes but not running the politics. In Egypt, it's became the opposite. So, and actually constitutionalized the fact that the status of the Copts is secondary. So whatever they suffered from over the centuries before became part of a modern or a pseudo-modern constitution where they are suffering. I can give tons of examples about what's happening. The civil status, the education. Today, okay, yes, they teach Arabic religion for Christians separate from the Muslim, but Islam is taught to everybody via the Arabic language. The Arabic language is full of texts of Quranic and Islamic texts that are imposed on everybody. So this is a back way to impose teaching Arabic on everyone. For instance, you cannot have an Arabic teacher who is a Copt in Egypt. You cannot have that. There's so many things. I mean, I just wanted to, time is running fast. I wanted to highlight the idea that, a modern nation state, which could have been and should have been the chance of treat everybody as equal citizens, has resulted into exactly the opposite of what's meant and exactly the opposite of what is happening everywhere. The discussion can go on for hours, but I think I should stop there. Thank you.